Everybody, welcome to Illinois Environmental Council's legal series CLE. Today we have two extremely distinguished speakers, and I'm very excited to hear from them to talk about how energy policy is made in Illinois, starting with the state legislature, and even before that with where ideas come to the state legislature, and then moving to implementation and regulation with the Illinois Commerce Commission. This is going to be a very a talk that really focuses on the procedure of how all of this gets done. I do encourage, if you do have questions, I am going to, everybody's going to be muted during the presentation other than the speakers. If you do have questions, please put them into the chat or we'll call on people afterwards. We expect to spend about 20 to 25 minutes on each speaker and then convene for questions around 12:50. So that's our process for today. So again, and I'll put the CLE in the chat a few times during this, but thanks to this great crowd for attending today. So I am very pleased to welcome State Representative Ann Williams, who will be speaking first. Ann is a Democratic member of the Illinois House of Representatives who has represented the 11th District since 2011. It includes the Chicago neighborhoods of West Lakeview, Roscoe Village, North Center, Lincoln Square, Lincoln Park, so parts of those communities. Ann is the current chair of the House Energy and Environment Committee, and she oversaw the process as we passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Energy Transition Act, through the state legislature. And often her committee considers quite a few energy and climate related bills. So I'm going to pass it off first to Ann Williams, and then I will introduce the Illinois Commerce Commission Chair, Carrie Zalewski. So go ahead, Representative Williams.
Thank you so much, Jen. Carrie, it's great to be here with you and great to see so many familiar faces on the Zoom today. So as Jen said, I represent the 11th District, which includes several Chicago neighborhoods. And I was lucky enough to be involved in the passage of this groundbreaking, nation-leading Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And so last night and yesterday, when I was thinking about how to present today, I thought, really kind of what happened behind the scenes is something that really might be more interesting to you than just going through the bill. Now, the bill itself is amazing and fascinating and groundbreaking and exciting, but many of you have probably already seen a little bit about what exactly is within that bill, and Carrie can elaborate on that. So I thought I'd focus on telling the story of how CEJA came to be and how we laid the foundation for the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, meaning what are the building blocks that we needed to pass legislation of this magnitude. And on some level, the items that I'm going to discuss are important in the passage of any bill. How intense they get and how important they are depends, of course, on the intensity and the scope of the legislation. But basically, it's kind of legislation 101 for a sweeping bill like the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So I will start with the obvious. First building block is you have to have an idea or a concept. So the concept of putting together a sweeping energy transition package would build on the gains of FEJA was in the works really since FEJA passed. And anyone in the energy world knows that as the Future Energy Jobs Act. We love our fun acronyms, but FEJA was passed in 2016. And in that bill, we provided for 25% renewable energy goals, financial incentives for solar and wind development, energy efficiency programming, and workforce development. The bill, by all accounts, was a big success, but if it did anything, it indicated the need for more work on these topics. At the time of passage, we knew that FEJA was only a start, that we need to do more, much more, to meet our goals and do our part to combat the escalating climate crisis. So sure enough, between 2016 and 2018, when we first started looking into what we should include in the next follow-up bill. The first incarnation of CEJA was introduced in 2019, but during that time, even that short period of time, public concern and public discourse about the climate crisis really grew exponentially. It was always in the news. People were talking about it out in the community. At political events, it was always top of mind in my community. And things like wildfires, the intensity of storms, and even here in the Midwest, in Chicago, lake water levels, and still we hear about these things. In fact, it thundered lightning last night around 4 a.m, if anyone heard that. There's snow in California. So obviously the issue isn't over, but it certainly had really escalated in terms of public discourse in the years between FEJA and when we first introduced CEJA. So it was something that the average constituent was paying attention to and was concerned about. And so that means, of course, that your legislators are paying attention to it, or at least hopefully they are. So in 2018, a coalition, which I'll get to shortly, started to embark upon a Listen, Lead, Share tour, which was an organized series of conversations held around the state, designed really to get at the bottom of what communities wanted to see in their clean energy future. That was what we were hoping to use to determine what we should include in the bill, as opposed to, per usual, a bunch of utility executives making decisions in some back room. So it looked a lot different, even in the beginning stages, than other energy bills in Springfield. Second building block, which is the really at the foundation, is a coalition of advocates, organizers, and lobbyists. So in this case, we had the Clean Jobs Coalition as really the impetus, the group that was responsible for getting the bill up and running. And this coalition was unlike any other I've seen in my years serving as a legislator. And even before that, working in around the Capitol, it was professional, it was expansive, it was inclusive. It was made up of a coalition of environmental advocacy organizations, businesses, community leaders from around the state, activists, consumer advocates, environmental justice groups, faith-based organizations, youth organizations, and they weren't in name only. There were some member groups to the Clean Jobs Coalition, and they all really played an important part in the development and the advancement of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. There's a reason I keep missing the names up. I'll explain later. So the coalition was incredibly well organized. They worked through their decisions and issues together really in a collaborative manner. I was invited 1 or 2 times over the course of the journey of CEJA to speak at one of the coalition's meetings, strategy meetings, and I was really blown away about how professional it was, how engaged everyone was, and how they truly collaborated to make decisions at every juncture. So I really would say this sort of coalition, maybe it won't be as expansive and large as the Clean Jobs Coalition, but having a coalition of like-minded people or organizations working for a bill is incredibly important, especially to get very tough, expansive legislation done. My third building block, of course, is having expertise on the topic or subject matter experts. And boy, did we have those involved in CEJA. With the topic as complex as energy, of course, you really do need experts both in substance and strategy to get the bill drafted, advanced, and negotiated. So you can have the brilliant minds in energy, but unless they know how to pass a bill in Springfield, you're not going to be successful. Likewise, you can have a great lobbying team, but without that substance, you're really not going to get the priorities of the coalition in the final product. So the Clean Jobs Coalition team included some of truly the most impressive and competent experts in the field. And the lobbying team was unbelievable. They worked their strategic magic throughout the process to position the bill, the issues, in a way that would ensure that we got the best package for communities, for constituents, and for the climate. So when I look back at the 3-year roller coaster ride that was CEJA, I can think of so many turning point moments where the expertise and or the creativity of the experts working on the bill and the amazing professionals that were part of this conversation moved the bill forward, or got a win on a particular issue, or got more support to ensure our priorities made it into the final negotiated package. The bill, just to let you know, did end up getting signed by the governor in fall of 2021. So it was, from beginning to end, quite a long process. So the lobbying leads, the advocacy organizations who worked around the Capitol day to day, the negotiators, every member of the team really was exceptional. And I'm not just saying that now, it really was an amazing journey, and I was excited to be a part of it. Our brilliant subject matter expert was so good that he drafted a significant portion of the final product, or he held the pen is the term that we used. And so he deserves a lot of credit for making sure it came together in a way that really prioritized the goals of the Clean Jobs Coalition, even as negotiations were happening fast and furious. Next up, a building block, and this is critical no matter what kind of bill you're talking about, would be to have a message. So the message, I think, really evolved over the 4-year journey that was CJA. But the message and tagline that sticks most in my mind is CJA can't wait. And this tied in so well to all components of the bill that were priorities. CJA actually became a brand, and that made a huge difference in its success, believe it or not. So at the beginning, when we introduced the bill, it was called the Clean Energy Jobs Act. By the end, the final product was the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And to this day, people still confuse it and call it different names. But at the bottom line is we had such a strong brand in the acronym CJA that there was absolutely no way we were changing it. And someone had to come up with a way to fit a really good name into CJA that wasn't the Clean Energy Jobs Act, to show the evolution of the product. And it really was the kind of thing that became almost a household word in the legislature. My colleagues would come up to me throughout the process and say, "Oh, heard from constituents again about CJA. What's going on with CJA? How are things with CJA?" It was kind of just a household name on the floor of the House and around the Capitol. And I don't remember another bill that was quite the same. So that was pretty impressive and really impactful. So the mechanics of the bill, back to the message point, were designed to propel us to our climate goals: investments in clean energy, green energy, energy efficiency provisions, the development of wind and solar. But equity was a thread that ran throughout the bill and touched all portions of the proposal. The most equitable climate bill in the nation. That's another tagline and brand that we used, and the governor still uses. I heard him do it not too long ago frequently, and one which was a cornerstone of all the negotiations around the bill. So CJA can't wait conveyed the urgency, and that urgency was conveyed to the constituents and the grassroots activists that were engaged around the bill. And they in turn conveyed this urgency to their legislators, who felt the urgency then when it came time to pass the bill. With regard to equity, we were doing something big. We wanted to be the most equitable climate bill in the nation. So those messages were more than taglines. They held with them a lot of important motivation, really, for different communities and different legislatures and caucuses to get involved and engaged in the bill. So jobs, workforce development, job training, wealth building, another point of conversation which mattered to communities and really dovetailed well into the equity conversation. And of course, in light of the far-reaching ComEd scandal that was taking place, unfortunately, at the same time we were trying to pass this bill, ethics and accountability was an important piece and something we talked about a lot and messaged around. This is not a utility bill. This is a climate bill. Another messaging point that became a tagline, but really was so much more. Having an accomplished professional communications team on board was really a game changer for the bill. Not everyone always has the luxury of utilizing professional media people in passing their bills, but when you do, take it, because it allowed us to get our message out to the public through social media, editorials, earned media, etc. And this directly transitioned to legislative support. even for legislators who were not as focused on environmental issues. They knew what CEJA was. They heard about CEJA. Many of their constituents were calling about it, told them they cared about it, and they wanted them to support it. So a little bit more on grassroots support to come. But another building block is champions in the legislature. This didn't happen just in the days and months leading up to the introduction of CEJA. These champions really were developed over time. And Jen and the IEC and all the member organizations worked hard really for years to build champions, to make sure that people wanted to be known as green members. We have a green caucus. And when I first started working in the House as a young staffer, environmental concerns were kind of an afterthought, something you could throw in extra if you got to the end of a particular legislative initiative. We really had to fight to be in the room in the early days, and I will credit Jen and the other organizations that work in around the Capitol every day for getting us in the room and building those champions that made it happen. So over time, we weren't just at the table. I would say in CEJA, we were, running the table at some points, and there was a built-in team of legislators that always wanted to be a part of the conversation and would come up to me and Jen and the other advocates and say, what can I do to help you move CEJA? What can I do to make this happen? So of course, diversity is critical when it comes to building an array of champions. Making sure all communities are represented is critical, both geographically and otherwise. A diverse array of voices in the advocacy space is so important when building these champions, and ensuring that the whole team is diverse is critical. Our speaker, Chris Welch, who was a new leader at the time, was a strong champion and prioritized our goal of ensuring that the bill was a climate bill. And that made a big difference in ensuring big picture support. Next, of course, if you know how the schoolhouse rock thing goes, it just doesn't go through the legislature. We need the governor to sign any bill. And needless to say, if the person who has the ability to sign or veto a bill isn't on your side, it's a real uphill battle to get things done. In the case of Governor Pritzker, he was closely aligned with our goals as the Clean Jobs Coalition. And the big one, it sounds like an obvious one, but we had to fight to ensure that the bill included strong decarbonization goals and actually limited carbon emissions. The governor stood strong on that point, not allowing us to move forward and taking that off the negotiating table eventually. He made it clear he would not sign a bill without strong decarbonization goals. And, it just sent the message to negotiators and stakeholders that we had to accommodate that piece, and that had to be a part of the final package. Sorry about that train horn. I'm in Springfield. If you can hear it, it's real loud. So the other item that I wanted to go to next in terms of a building block is the idea of grassroots support. Now, I talked about advocacy and coalition building, but I wanted to pull out grassroots support in a whole different way. I have never seen grassroots activity as excited and engaged as I did during CEJA. The advocates are great and have their lobby days, and they're professionals that work around the rail, but regular people in the communities that get on a bus to drive to Springfield and rally around the Capitol and visit their legislators, there's really nothing that can take the place of that. Legislators are motivated based on what they are hearing from their voters and the people in their community. I mean, I can call my colleagues all day and all night, so can the lobbyists, but unless they're hearing from members of their community, it really is just not going to happen. So the grassroots support, and I've told engaged volunteers and grassroots activists, I've told this to them, and it's really true. But for their engagement, the bill would not have made it across the finish line. It became not just a household name, but it became something that legislators understood their communities cared about enough to visit them in Springfield, to call, to send how many form emails, to show up at events, show up at town hall meetings. And that was really just a critical piece. We're getting down to the final building blocks, but one that I think wouldn't normally come to mind, but is just so important to remember, especially with regard to this project, was time and patience. So many large scale bills take time, years even, to pass. And I sent a group text to my colleagues and said, what are some bills that come to mind that took a long time to get passed? Marriage equality was one that didn't happen overnight, obviously. One close to my heart, opening birth certificates for adoptees, that took a decade to pass. The Reproductive Health Act, paid family leave, just finally passed after years of effort. Legalization of cannabis, and what we hope to pass this week or next, the polystyrene or styrofoam ban. I don't know, that's been 2 or 3, 4 years in the making. So that's important to remember. This bill took years to pass, but we did it the right way. And we did it in a way that took time, but it got all the building blocks in place and poised us for final passage. So, we all knew this wasn't going to happen overnight, but we actually needed that time in some ways. Looking back, it's easy to say since it's done now. But we utilized that time. We built support during that time. We engaged more communities. We diversified our coalition. We furthered the brand of our bill, and we garnered the energy and momentum to get it passed. So that by the time we passed it, we were ready to go. I mean, we were ready. And I think everyone else, we may have gotten some votes just because people were tired of hearing about it. But, either way, we got it done. So, sometimes support and momentum for a big bill needs time to develop. And by the time we passed the bill, everyone knew what CJA was. Legislators and many people in the community still know what it is and still bring it up. And I see them at coffee shops. And thank you for working on CJA. Thanks for what you did. It still gets talked about. I'll add that, time is also needed to negotiate the bill and work through challenges and really synthesize priorities. We, by our nature, the legislative process is built around, some might call it procrastination, but often, if you look at a typical legislative session, the most activity occurs literally in the last week. We don't plan it methodically and work as session goes on. We kind of wait till, the stakes are the highest and we're running out of time to really get the big decisions done. I don't think there's anything you can do to change that, but we got to a critical mass point, and that really took time to do. So, it comes to mind, when I was thinking about the timeline last night, we had hoped to pass the bill in 2021, and we were ready to pass the bill in 21. And up till the last few days of session, I kind of thought we were going to get it passed. But in 2021, in May, we hadn't yet won the battle to ensure that the bill that we passed would lead with climate and contain the strong decarbonization bills that we wanted to see. It actually took a few more months, and those of you who worked on the bill on the call will remember it took a few more months really to coalesce around that and make sure that unequivocally we were going to make it a climate bill and have strong decarbonization provisions. So the final 2 building blocks are kind of my favorites, and they are the willingness to they go together though. One is the willingness to compromise, and the other is the willingness to hold the line. And there's a Kenny Rogers song in there, I think, but that's really what successful legislation is about. You have to be willing to compromise. And sometimes we hear from our advocates and allies who are true believers and really want to see something happen, and they don't want to compromise in absolutely no way. But really, that's not how legislation works. And we very rarely get a bill, especially one like this, passed in the form that we introduced it in. It would be virtually impossible. So, the CJC and the legislative advocates, we really worked through negotiating points with the other stakeholders. Not just the utilities and the renewable developers, but among, our friends and allies. So within the coalition, I wasn't on all those calls, but I know there were healthy and robust discussions among the people on that call about kind of where to draw the line, where to hold the line, where to compromise. And it really was a collaborative effort there. We also worked at sometimes we're at odds with one of the Democrat Party's natural allies, and that was organized labor. We wanted to pass a strong organized labor. We wanted to preserve jobs, but we also wanted to ensure we were doing what was best for the environment and ensuring communities most in need were served, and equity led throughout the bill. So all those points were hard to balance, and it's like the whack-a-mole game. Sometimes you'd accommodate one group and the other group would have an issue, and so on and so forth. And that's really what negotiations are. So Conversely, you have to know when to hold the line. And there were many examples where we, got to a point that we wouldn't go any farther on the discussions or negotiations. And luckily, we were often in lockstep with the governor's office on this point. But one real life example from the negotiating room is really illustrates this point. The negotiations were structured kind of in buckets. We were going to first talk about efficiency, then we'd talk about wind and solar development, then we'd talk about community solar, and so on and so forth, all the topics. And a few of us, myself included, really kept pushing for the conversation on decarbonization. Let's talk about our goals here. Let's talk how we're going to structure this. Fija, we made some progress, but we really want to set this in stone. We really want to move forward. And okay, everyone was listening. The group was collaborating. We all kind of talked, and out pops the first kind of outline of the first bill, and that came out of the working group and the negotiating table. And the first draft was great, but it was wildly deficient in the area of decarbonization. And it said something like, the language was literally, the state of Illinois shall strive to reduce carbon emissions. And we're all like, what? No, we are not going to strive. We are going to put this in the bill. And that was a place we decided to hold the line. We had a letter. I forget whose idea it was, but someone decided to write a letter, and we all worked together, and we had a letter that was signed by 40 some legislators that said, we will not support a climate package that does not, energy bill package that does not provide for strong decarbonization provisions and ensure we have equity at every turn. That translated to a tagline that I saw in a PowerPoint presentation recently. So it had staying power. And that was no climate, no equity, no deal. And I know a lot of people on you were among those that were participating in that conversation, but it is a tagline that we use, but it really stood for the core of where we were going to hold the line. We would not move off that. So if you want to pass the climate bill, you go ahead, but you were doing it without the 43 of us who were the climate champions. So it worked, and we ended up with just that. We ended up compromising in a way that took care of all the stakeholders, protected communities, ensured consumers won, held utilities accountable, and held the line where we needed to. So that's basically the building blocks that went into passing the nation-leading Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So thank you for your time. Thank you for engaging. And I might have missed a few, and feel free to ask any questions at the end. I look forward to hearing Carrie talk about the meat.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to put for folks here, again, this is the place you need to put your ARDC number to get CLE credit. So please go in there and fill that out. Now I would like to introduce to you Carrie Zalewski, who is the chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission. She serves as a utility regulator, an energy attorney with an engineering background with over 15 years of experience in environmental and energy regulation, an extensive background in public utility regulation, environmental policy and compliance, wholesale power issues, and corporate governance. Carrie was also on the Illinois Pollution Control Board. And so brings to us a lot of administrative law experiences. And I am going to share her slides. All right, I've got you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start while you bring those slides up. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you, Jen and the IEC, for inviting me to speak. As Jen mentioned, I serve as the chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission, where we balance the interests of consumers and utilities to ensure reliable, safe, least cost water, gas, and electric services. But now, thanks to the leadership of Representative Williams, we have a whole new toolbox where we're trying to build the grid of the future to ensure we meet our clean energy goals. Next slide.
Right, and are we seeing the presenter view or the right slides? Does it look okay?
It looks fine, I think. Okay. Yes.
Yep. Okay, cool. Thanks. All right.
Yep. So if you go to the second slide. 20. Are you able to advance it, Jen?
Oh, I did.
I'm just seeing the first. I can keep talking though.
Is this? Did it advance at all?
No, it didn't. You're on
the
image of my building. Yeah.
Let me.
I'll keep talking though. Yeah.
Okay.
So I just, first off, want to say thank you to Representative Williams first for laying out the story. I didn't realize the backstory of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act and the Clean Energy Jobs Act. I've heard it called both, so that makes a whole lot of sense. But I want to thank her for her leadership and her foresight in passing this legislation. And because of her leadership and everyone in the Clean Energy Caucus, we have these goals. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we meet those goals, how we put into action the fruits of Representative Williams' labor. That looks great. Thanks, Jen. And explain a little bit about the brilliance of the bill that was crafted. Now, before I talk a little bit about what we're working on at the commission, I must say that we rule on these cases. There are docketed procedures, and we speak through our written order. And so I have to be very careful and mindful of speaking to anything outside the docket. So what instead I'll do is rely upon the language of the legislation and talk a little bit more about how it all fits in to meeting our goal. And if questions are asked that push us towards open dockets, I'll be sure to steer us clear. So my life was changed forever on September 15th of 2021. I think of my life BC, before CEJA, after CEJA, where we were given a lot of new tools and authority at the commission to meet very tight statutory deadlines. Because as Representative Williams said, the climate can't wait, CEJA can't wait. And so you feel that sense of urgency that is put into these statutory deadlines. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean about that. But first, what I want to do is kind of paint a picture of how the energy world looked just 18 years ago. So when CEJA was signed into law on September 15th of 2021, think about the things that were different. Think about the things that the drafters of CEJA could not have known. For example, there have since been major federal funding bills that have passed. For example, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IJA, and the Inflation and Reduction Act. So IJA was being discussed but not passed. The Inflation Reduction Act, federal funding, once in a generation money that is going to come down and support and build up our clean energy economy nationally, was not even on people's minds and radar, frankly. Also, this was before the war in Ukraine started. And we have now, of course, seen spiking gas prices, both internationally and certainly at home in Illinois. This is something that we could not have predicted. Also, accelerated inflation and supply chain issues. And then continuing of extreme weather days. And what I'm noticing, I work in the grid space, and what I'm seeing is that these extreme weather events are impacting the grid in ways that are very unpredictable, that are not modeled for. And so we're seeing new issues on our grid. We certainly had some really tight conditions for Winter Storm Elliott on December 24th and 25th. And this had a lot to do with the way that the weather is impacting our grid in these different systems. And so why do I bring all this up? Well, CEJA is helping us get a jump start to get ahead of these issues, to plan for the grid of the future. And that really is the brilliance of CEJA. It proactively plans for the grid we want, getting ahead of the issues, availing ourselves of these federal funding opportunities, and acknowledging that things will continue to change. And so, of course, Climate and Equitable Jobs Act has climate and equity and jobs in the title, but I see it as having other cornerstones. It's nearly 1,000 pages of legislation that brings into different aspects. For example, it brings in transparency and robust stakeholder engagement. Representative Williams talked a lot about how this was part of the process, the process of writing the legislation. Well, we see it now on the implementation front, and I'll talk a bit about that in the examples I provide. Also, it's iterative. And what I mean by that is that it builds upon itself. So one docket before the ICC feeds into the next docket to ultimately lead to this overarching docket, the multi-year grid plan, which is kind of the end of the first round of CEJA. And then third, I already mentioned that we're heading to our first round. There are rounds of CEJA, acknowledging this isn't just a one and done thing. It's going to build upon itself, and then we go back and we revisit in a couple of years to make sure and to continue to plan for that futuristic smart grid that we want to see in Illinois. And I have to also mention that CEJA even thought through staffing issues. Our staff at the Illinois Commerce Commission is some of the most dedicated staff. All credit goes to them to make sure that we meet these statutory deadlines. But CEJA also gave us 50 new headcount at the ICC. So for an agency of 250 is a big number. It gave us new lawyers and engineers and CPAs and other technical people to help us implement it. So again, really thinking through everything we can need to get this right. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I like this picture just as a visual of kind of what we're working with. I call this grid 1.0. This is your grandfather's grid. It's really even your parents' grid. If you look at the left, you see the generation source. These are usually fossil fuel, centrally located, large generation sources that feeds into the transmission system, that feeds into the distribution system, which the commission regulates, and then to this box, the house is the end user. But it's starting to look a lot different. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So on the left side, you see that there are different resources. There's, of course, the fossil fuel is still in existence on the grid, but now we have these variable energy resources, solar and storage. I want you to think through how that interacts with the grid. And then there's, of course, things like grid scale storage. And then you'll also know when you start moving to the right, you see an arrow that moves two ways. So it's not just feeding electrons one way from generation source to end use, it's moving in two directions, which is exciting, but that means complex. So you see it moving two ways of transmission, two ways of distribution. And then you get to this end use picture. And it's not just the house. There is a lot of democratization of the grid. There's choice of how you use your electricity, when you use it, where you get it from, again, which is all wonderful and exciting things, but it also means that these are more complicated problems to solve. You see pictures of microgrid, demand response, which is actually being very helpful when we sort through some of these extreme weather events. Energy efficiency, you see solar panels on houses that are feeding back into the grid, the electrification of the transportation sector, and then the distributed storage. So this is what this is the aim, but how we get there is what we're all working towards at the ICC. Okay, next slide. So this is just generally the goals of CEJA. CEJA does a lot of things. I mentioned it's nearly 1,000 pages of legislation, and we are working to implement these goals with other sister agencies, namely the IPA. I know Anthony Starr is listening as well. I'm sure he has lots of stories to tell about CEJA, the IFA, DCO, IEPA, and we all have our part to meet our goals. But generally speaking, these are the goals that are listed by CEJA, with retirements in place and zeroing out our emissions and getting to 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. But of course, I'm going to focus on what the commission's doing to help to meet these goals. Okay, next slide. So what I'm going to do next, these are just kind of an example, a taste of what we're doing to implement CEJA. And this is, I think, will help color in where the rubber meets the road, how we meet these goals and plan for this grid of the future. So I kind of have 3 slides here talking about what's been completed at the commission, proceedings that are in progress in the next slide, and then finally what is ahead in the next year. So first we start with a baseline audit. All right, so we want to look at what is the condition of the current grid. We want to see where money has been spent in the last 9 years on things like advanced metering infrastructure to identify deficiencies and to create a baseline. In creating a baseline of seeing what's on the grid and what is needed, we can then measure our progress going forward through that final round of CEJA, which includes a multi-year grid plan. More on that later. And then also I have listed here the energy storage report. We know that the General Assembly indicated that storage is a crucial part of the future of Illinois' generation mix. So to figure out what is needed and what really the true value is of storage in Illinois, we put forward a 12-day multi-hour workshop series. So this speaks to that inclusive, transparent forum where first we started with PhDs from Sandia National Lab. It's a Department of Energy national lab that we brought in experts on storage issues, and they talked about different types of technologies and different types of value that they can bring to the grid. And then we open it up to other sorts of developers and other sorts of businesses that have this technology and can speak to how storage can really interact with the grid. This ultimately ended up in a report that we filed. It was due May of 2022 before the General Assembly. So it's currently on the desk of legislators. Then also low income rate. This speaks to that equity piece. So we were required under CEJA to look at the value of a discounted rate for customers that qualify for this time of rate, acknowledging that access to heat and power truly are basic human rights, and that we know that low-income residents are hit the hardest and are biggest risks of being cut off from these services. So CEJA requires us to look at rate structures for low income. And at the end of this docket, the commission directed all large gas and electric utilities to file discount rates in their next rate design. So in 2023 for gas and in 2024 for electric. So you see some of these are open dockets before us now, what a low income rate might look like. Okay, moving on to next slide, which is the proceedings in progress. Okay, I'm gonna spend a little time here. There's a lot open before us now. So the multi-year grid plan, I talked about how these different dockets build upon themselves and ultimately end in this multi-year grid plan, which we need to decide by December of this year. So this grid plan, it's forward-looking. It's a forward-looking approach to build that smart grid that we want to see in Illinois. Before we did more of a backward-looking short-term review of how money was spent to build out the grid. Now we're looking forward 4 to 5 years to plan for the grid we want, and we will plan for the grid and then make sure that the money that is spent by the utilities matches that plan, so we can meet our goals in a reliable and least cost way. The second thing you see is the beneficial electrification plans. This is how the ICC helps the state meet its 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. Now, certainly other agencies have a huge part to play in this. And so we're working to ensure the numbers do increase, but I think perhaps more importantly, we're trying to make sure that when EVs come online and when people plug in their EVs to charge, we are sending the right price signals and incentives so that the usage and so that the load helps the grid, doesn't harm the grid. So if we send the right price signal and we tell someone, for example, to charge at an off-peak time, or when others are not trying to use the grid, it can ultimately help with reliability and even cost for all if done correctly. If we do it wrong, it could cause havoc on the grid. And so this is looking at how do we do this? And this will be decided very soon. It needs to be decided before the end of March. So be on the lookout for that docket. The Renewable Energy Access Plan. So we're part of 2 RTOs. These are wholesale markets that we buy service on behalf of our default customers, but also through people can go on and buy electrons through the wholesale market, through PJM and MISO. And so as a regulator in Illinois, we're trying to make sure we have the right amount of transmission. We know that getting transmission right is an important way to meet our clean energy goals, to do so reliably and in a least cost way. So the REAP, as we call it, the Renewable Energy Access Plan, gives us a plan, gives us a process to make sure we get it right. So it looks at transmission needs within our state, statewide, crossing those 2 RTOs. ComEd is in PJM and Ameren is in MISO. And so we look at those 2 areas combined, and we look at our goals, and we take into consideration things like land use and load growth and look at how much transmission we need and where it should lie. And so this is a series of drafted plans that are currently out. And so please take a look at that and review and comment if you have it. Okay, next thing is the Consumer Intervenor Compensation Fund. And again, this is another example how we ensure there is transparency and equity in the ability to participate in our dockets. So this is a fund created to allow for consumer interest representation in the ICC to ensure that the ability to engage an attorney or to file testimony isn't a burden to participate in the dockets. So you can apply for the fund and access these funds to, again, participate and be compensated through this fund. Next issue is the Equitable Energy Upgrade Program. This is the workshop series. Okay, so we know that renewable resources, for example, the ability to put solar panels on your roof, if financed correctly, could potentially save money for customers. And it's low-income customers that could use this sort of help on their bills the most. But a lot of them don't have access to the type of financing or the upfront costs that we might not have. It might be too burdensome. So what this does is it allows, it looks at how a low-income resident could avail themselves to some of these types of resources, making sure that they don't take on the risk of some of the financing. It's called the pay-as-you-save system that we're looking at. So if a low-income resident wants to put solar panels on the roof, this would ensure that their bill doesn't automatically go up. It's spread out in a way that their bill should, in the aggregate, go down. All right, so interconnection working group. This creates a forum to allow for generators and utilities to talk about the issues of interconnection. Because if the interconnection process isn't functioning properly, we cannot meet our clean energy goals in a timely fashion. So it's important that this process goes through seamlessly and there is a continuing and collaborative approach to ensure interconnections are happening. And then the last one is performance and tracking metrics. What's interesting about performance metrics, other states sometimes call them PIMs, performance incentive metrics. These is a trend that's happening nationally in other states. Hawaii was a state that comes to mind. They put in PIMs early on, but their PIMs took 7 years to complete. We did ours within 9 months, and we did that under legislative timeline. And a lot of the metrics that we were to meet were sketched out in the legislative language. So the legislators decided and wrote down things that were important things to incentivize the utilities to accomplish. Things like reliability and decreasing peak load and streamlining interconnection of renewables. And if the utilities were to meet these goals, then they can receive further compensation in meeting these goals. So just another tool that we have to ensure that the way that money is being spent is aligning with our goals. Okay, next slide. I'm going to move on to what's ahead. All right, so 2 points here. Value of distributed energy resources. This will be initiated no later than June 30th under CEJA. So this is going to create a value stream. So again, we're trying to bring renewables online to ensure that with the retirements of fossil fuel resources, they are replaced by the type of resources we want and need. We want to make sure that when they're brought online, they are valued appropriately. How much and where these things are interconnected onto the grid, on the distribution grid, matters. And so this will look at a rebate system to make sure there's value streams for things like solar and storage. So be on the lookout for that. And then the energy equitable upgrade, I already discussed how we were doing the workshops on the previous slide. This will be the docketed process. So next slide just has our website. And I encourage everyone, we have on our ICC website, we have a page that's dedicated to CEJA. And so everything I discussed will be discussed in detail, and everything that's filed within those dockets will be included on the website. So thanks again, Jen, and thanks again, Representative Williams, for being up here to discuss this today.
I'm Okay, great. So I did get a couple of questions in the chat, and please put these questions in the chat. We will just for folks, this is recorded and it's going to be on YouTube later, so you'll be able to access it there, and we will also put a copy of the slides as a link in YouTube, so it'll all be available and you can watch it online. So I did have a question in the chat, which is there a report somewhere that shows the percentage of solar / renewable customers in each zip code? Do we know if that exists?
I feel like the IPA would probably have a better finger on the pulse here, but I know that when we talk about zip code, when I hear if things are filed publicly on zip code, I know that part of CEJA is required for disconnections. So getting to that equity piece again, looking at where the percentage of solar renewable customers are by each zip code, I'm not sure where that lies. I'm happy to follow up with an answer if it does exist.
Yeah, well, we'll look at, I'll ask my folks about that too. So thank you for putting that in there. Feel free if folks want to put questions in the chat. Our EEU, this is from Naomi Davis, are the EEUP workshops analyzing affordability? And do you maybe want to talk overall about affordability? I think that would be both good for Chairman Zalewski and Williams to look at how our legislators thinking about affordability.
Well, I don't know the specific, did you want Naomi to, I was just gonna say, I know there's legislation pending that deals with this exact issue, and I haven't taken a deep dive into it yet, but we did, obviously, consumers were at the top of the list of priorities, making sure the bill was good for consumers. In terms of the specifics, Naomi, you're the expert on this, not me, so.
Yeah, Naomi, go ahead if you just really briefly. Oh, you're still on mute.
Just wanting to always underscore and thanks for this great insight from in this workshop, that there is no equity if the final product on the bill to customers is not affordable. And we know that we have record profits, and we've got record threats of disconnects, we have record debt, and we have 5 rate cases before the ICC right now for record rate increases. And the idea that somehow higher rates are going to be affordable. We're on a trajectory for catastrophe for low and moderate income families. So it's why I'm asking about, tactically and practically how affordability factors in to the decision-making process on the record.
I couldn't agree with you more. Affordability is always top of mind when we're deciding these cases. Affordability comes into play in a lot of places, a lot of different dockets. So before CEJA was even open, we opened a docket about the definition of affordability. We know that there's LIHEAP, but does LIHEAP capture all of the people that are struggling in Illinois, and are the people that can receive LIHEAP have access to it? I mean, one thing I mentioned was the low income rate. So that'll be a big part of looking at affordability. What does that look like within a rate case? Creating this rate structure, a discounted rate if you are considered low income. And I know low income needs to be defined and determined. So that's one example. You specifically asked Naomi about EEUP. Yes, there is a conversation of affordability. So again, the idea is that you can access this new type of financing. So it'll be rolled into your bill and you will not pay more. Your bill should not go up if you enroll in this bill. And if it does go up, there's safeguards to ensure it doesn't. So affordability comes in, it's interwoven into a lot of our dockets, but I couldn't agree with you more. It's a top of mind for sure.
Thank you.
And just
sorry, go ahead. We just have a couple more.
Just a quick follow-up in terms of the ability of neighbors and bill payers to access the ICC and chime in with their vote and testimony. Is there an anticipation of evening meetings or times when sessions can happen when ordinary neighbors who are carrying these utilities can have their say with the ICC?
Yeah, I have a couple points. So to that exact point, CEJA required some of our workshop series to be held at night and in different parts of the state. And that's indeed what we did. So past 5 o'clock to ensure that folks can certainly participate. The ability to file something at the commission is always available. We have a 1-800 number through our website, and you can call our consumer services division. We have people answering the phone 8 to 5 days a week. They can speak English and Spanish at all times. So people can help file things at the commission. You can always speak through our public comment period at the beginning of every meeting. So there are ample ways to participate. And then I also mentioned the intervener compensation fund. That's, lawyers are expensive. And so that's the ability to apply to access some of these funds if you qualify, to hire a lawyer, to put testimony forward. So that's another safeguard that, again, is put in place under CEJA.
Thank you. We look forward to working closely with you to
Great,
keep
thank
improving
you.
that access.
Okay, I got one more question in the chat, maybe two more that I'll ask briefly. And Anne, did you want to add anything to that question or?
Well, mine's kind of an overall point, but just hearing the discourse between Naomi Davis and Chairman Zalewski, it's one of the other building blocks that I didn't mention, but I think is so evident through all these questions, is you have to have an agency that is willing and able and resourced enough and competent enough to be able to implement this bill. So we passed a sweeping 1,000-page bill, and wipe our hands of it is done. We're celebrating. We have a signing and a party and everything else. And then all the work begins. And I just wanted to point out, Chairman Zalewski, when you were going through your presentation, I was remembering about the negotiating room. And by the way, I do have a colleague on the Zoom that was in the negotiating room, Representative Evedina Delgado, who's here, who's an expert on these issues too, but she can attest to the fact that whenever we didn't know what to do with a topic or weren't sure how to handle something, we often said, let's give that to the ICC. Let's have the ICC handle that. Let's put this in the ICC bucket. So we were cognizant of the fact that we were dumping a lot of work and a lot of responsibility on the ICC and IPA and other agencies, but particularly the ICC. So I think that's another important component. It is without the, agency doing its work, it wouldn't have mattered what we did. So that I don't want to underestimate how much we really did give you as a result. And thank you for your work.
Great, thank you so much. We just have 2 minutes and we really do have to go. But I just, in terms of the question, just last piece here, there's a question about if there's reports on public awareness on energy consumer understandability of the website and electronic transactions, including in cooperation with DCO, Departments of Public Health and Department of Innovation and Technology. There also was a question about access for equity situations to access Justice 40. And I will say we do have a bill about a Justice 40 commission. So let's just end on that one. If you guys want to, if you have any thoughts, otherwise we can always follow up by email. You guys want to put some end thoughts in, and then I will close with the CLE requirements.
I'll just add, generally speaking, everyone uses water and heat and electric services. And so, and these issues, as you can quickly see, are very complicated. So I agree, it's really important to ensure public awareness. We're doing our best on our end. When I came into this role, we totally revamped our website, and we have a whole consumers page. How much traffic it gets, I'm not sure, but we try to push that information out. We try to push things out on social. We try to work and make sure this information is available. I mentioned we have someone that answers the phone live 5 days a week to answer any and every question. So we're trying. There's always more work to be done.
And I would say on the part of legislators too, it's our responsibility to synthesize all the work that we do down here in a way that's digestible and accessible for our constituents, especially on something like this, which does have such a direct impact on their lives. So that's something we're constantly working on, trying to share that information. And yeah, I think all the groups too that Jen represents too as well.
Great. So thank you both so much for coming. We're going to end now. I'm going to put, make sure I have the correct link. I think this is the most attorneys I've ever had on a CLE, so you'll be invited back. Here is the link for the CLE. For those of you filling it out, please make sure I have your ARDC number and your email, or I can't send you the certificate that I'm going to need to print out for you. So make sure that that's in there, fill that out today. We'll be trying to send certificates out today. And IEC is trying to do a whole series of CLE. Representative Williams often attends our free CLE because there's some really great and engaging topics we've covered. If you're interested in a topic or interested in presenting on something, please let me know. You get extra credit there and we can offer the CLE. So it's my goal to get all of my CLE through IEC before the reporting deadline for me this year. So I hope that you'll all join us in the future. Really appreciate you all, especially our presenters, Representative Ann Williams and Chairman Carrie Zalewski. Just appreciate you both so much. This was really informative, and like I said, it will be on YouTube, and we will also share the slides there. So check that out and feel free to follow up with us with any questions. So really appreciate everybody. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for attending.